everybody, and welcome to another bonus episode of Horror Movie Night. This week, I am sitting down with Amelia Moses, who is the director of the new film Bleed With Me. This is her directorial debut. It's playing at FANTASIA 2020, but as we know, film festivals look very different in 2020. So I was able to get a really cool screener copy and sit down with Amelia. Amelia, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, I mean, and you can be totally honest with this, but you got to admit, I would imagine that your first feature film kind of going out on like a virtual film festival is got to be a little bit of a bummer.
It definitely was. I remember when Fantasia first informed me that they were going to do that, it was definitely a bit of a blow, because I feel like as filmmakers, that's all you're kind of working towards, really, is that, like, in the dark room, you know, in the theater with the audience, on the big screen, that's just, like, really what everyone wants. And so it was definitely disappointing, but I feel like the festival obviously made the best choice, considering the circumstances and stuff. And I think they really made the most of that situation, and still made a really big effort to promote the films and keep everything exciting. So in the end, it was still a really nice premiere.
No, I think, and I think that, like, there's something about this movie, and I mean this in, like, the biggest compliment possible, but because it's such a minimal movie, you know what I mean? Like, it's three people, it's one location, it's not as jarring to have to watch virtually as, like, you know, something like Tenet that they're saying has to come out in a theater. It has to have, like, the IMAX experience or whatever Christopher Nolan wants to tell himself. But I thought that I was captivated. It kept my attention. It wasn't like a lot of other times where you watch a movie on your laptop and you're kind of distracted and looking around the room. The movie keeps your attention, so it doesn't need to be on a big screen to keep you focused, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, no, thank you. That's a huge compliment, because I do feel like, you know, I feel like it's going to continue, that films are going to be now less in theaters, potentially moving forward, regardless of coronavirus. I think that's just, like, where things are shifting anyways, you know, or kind of simultaneous releases where you have, like, theatrical and at home at the same time or whatever. But it's very easy. I mean, I get distracted when I watch films at home. You know, I look at my phone, or I'm on my laptop and there's another browser open. Like, I would hate to admit that, but it's true, right? We all do it. Even though I love, you know, movies and stuff, that's the kind of good thing about going to a cinema, is that you really aren't distracted by anything. So, no, that totally means a lot that you were, you know, still engaged with the film despite kind of not being in the optimal circumstances.
And it's a very different movie, but again, like I said, the movie looks incredible. And the way I explained it to a friend of mine was, like, everything is minimal in it. It's a small cast, it's one location, but it doesn't look like a low-budget movie. It feels so focused, and, you know, it doesn't feel like a directorial debut. It doesn't feel like any of those things. It feels like a well-thought-out, well-planned type thing. So can you tell me a little bit about the writing of this, the focus on this? Who was some of the inspirations that you pulled visually for this?
Yeah, well, definitely kind of everything you're talking about in terms of the minimalism was pretty intentional, partly for budget reasons, but I think it's like when you have a micro budget, you have to embrace those things and let them be part of the world building in a lot of ways. And I think a big part of why the film still has kind of hopefully a good production value is because of the location we had too. And I think that was, like, a really big goal of mine, was finding a location that, you know, we exist in it for the entirety of the film. So it has to have that atmosphere. It has to have the right feeling to it and visually be interesting, somewhere that we want to kind of exist in for those 80 minutes. Yeah, and then in terms of the writing process, again, it was very much working within those limitations. I knew I wanted to stick with three characters in one location, because it definitely is a character study. It's very character driven. An early film that was kind of inspiring for me early on in the writing process was the Duplass brothers film Baghead, because it's kind of a similar setup of, like, these characters going to, you know, a cabin in the woods, but that film really just takes its time, because it's more of a mumblecore film, to just exist with the characters and spend time with them. There's a lot of kind of dialogue heavy scenes, but you're just it's not necessarily about the plot moving forward. It's just kind of about spending some time with these characters. So that definitely was inspiring early on in the writing process. So my kind of main goal was to have a film that kind of combined those two things, where you have these more grounded character moments, and then more kind of genre horror moments, and kind of the juxtaposition of those two worlds kind of thing. So that's kind of always been the driving force throughout the film, and that kind of impacted stuff with the cinematography and visually too. We kind of tried to set some rules to kind of distinguish those two tones as well. So anything that was more kind of grounded or just kind of spending time with the characters was handheld, and then things that were supposed to be more dreamlike, more horror-like, were kind of dolly and sticks. So we were just trying to kind of subtly show a bit of a difference between those two tones, I guess.
No, and that makes sense. I think, not to harp again on the just three people, but I think just having three people also builds the tension a lot more. Not that there's anything that I've seen like this movie specifically, but, we've seen plenty of people in a cabin movie. And
for sure, yeah.
A lot of those times, if you're introducing all these other people and townies, and it kind of adds this element of well, just leave and just there's clearly other people in this world, go be with one of them and you might be safer. But only having it be these three characters, you feel that claustrophobia and you feel that trapped in this circumstance and there's nowhere else to go. And I love that about
it. For sure. Well, I think in this film too, the intention was also it's a cabin in the woods film, but it's not the killer in the woods. There's nothing that they're running from. There's no external threat. It's really the internal threat and the kind of tension between those three characters. So it becomes less, nothing beyond them really is important to the story, because it's like our entire world is just that cabin. And I kind of like when films don't really, I don't know, it's such a constructed medium, and obviously there's a range of things, and some films really want to dial into that, quote unquote realism, but inevitably you are constructing a reality. And so I think sometimes kind of interesting where you just sort of ignore everything else and you just go within this film, this is everything that exists, because I think it creates maybe a more focused feel.
So what drew you to horror?
Yeah, I mean, I've always, loved horror movies. I grew up watching a lot of horror films. My dad's a big horror fan, so, I watched things like The Wicker Man and The Shining way too young in my life. But I watched a lot of Hammer horror films with him, and
that makes sense.
Lots of kind of British horror films, from the 60s and 70s, and there was just always something about them. Again, I think maybe it's the world building and the kind of aesthetic that they just were so their own thing. And so, whether you like that or not, whether you enjoyed the campiness or whatever it is, it was very much its own world that it existed in. And I think that really appealed to me. But it took me a while to kind of embrace it as a filmmaker. I went to film school in Montreal, and I feel like film school can be quite limiting because everyone's kind of trying to make the same movie. And in Montreal and at film school, it kind of felt like everyone's trying to make this family drama. And, because you're in such a bubble when you're in film school, you kind of forget about the plethora of styles that, you could make, right? And so it wasn't really until I finished film school that I kind of embraced the genre more. I remember talking to another student at film school and mentioning that I kind of wanted to make a horror film, and they kind of laughed me off a bit because it was just that's not really something you do. And I think that's the kind of continuous argument of low or high art and certain genres being more well regarded or whatever. But I think as soon as I finished school, I very much felt the liberty to do it whatever the fuck I wanted to do. And so I made a body horror short that I was I'm fully going to embrace this genre. We're going to go gory and nasty and Cronenberg-esque, and I'm just going to go for it. And then I felt okay, now I really feel confident in this genre and feel like it's a really good place to explore a lot of ideas and a lot of kind of grounded things that I feel or I observe, anxieties or insecurities or whatever, kind of interpersonal dynamics, but then you're placing them in this heightened world which I think is a really cool way to explore things.
Yeah, and I get what you're talking about with the film school stuff. I have a very good friend of mine who was in film school back in the mid to late 90s, and he always tells me about he made a short that played at a lot of festivals. It did really, really well at the time. And it was called Gay by Dawn, and it was he joked that it was a horror short for homophobes because no one had made a film to scare homophobes, and what's scarier than homosexuality to a homophobe. And it was kind of playing up the absurdity of that, and it's actually a very I like what he did with it. It's funny, it's unique, but he said the only reason he thinks that short had any success was that he was the only person with a funny horror short, while everyone else had. He goes, when you're up against 15 other films that are about a guy's complicated relationship with his father, whatever you're making is going to stand out with people. It's going to be different. And he said that even back then it was such this oh, you can't make a comedy, you can't make a horror movie. This is film school. You need to make art. And that line of
for sure,
it's such a terrible line that you can't make art if you're making comedy or horror, when honestly the last 4 or 5 years horror's probably been the most artistic, genre pushing things coming out.
Totally. And it kind of allows you to explore things that you might not be able to talk about in a different package, I guess, too. I think it allows you to talk about some of the uncomfortable things in yourself, internal things, elements of darkness or whatever that can be a hard thing to explore. Or you can also look at some stuff in society as well, and comment on some things that in a drama just wouldn't work. Something like Get Out is obviously a perfect example of that. He was able to look at something that's so real, but then, and that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about. But then because it was in this super accessible package, it just made it he was able to make these really, bold statements and important statements. But it was because he used, genre to tell that story. So, and that's been going on forever, basically. Yeah. As long as horror movies have existed. It was funny when Get Out came out, because I feel like a lot of my friends who saw it, who weren't really into horror films, were just wow, it's it's taking social issues and then talking about them in a horror format, and you're yep, this isn't new. He's done something really amazing with it, but this isn't new. This is the the pattern, or what horror's been doing for a long time.
Yeah. And it's always so insulting too. I feel like every time a horror movie gets nominated for a major award, it's suddenly a thriller. You know what I mean?
Yes, 100%. Yes, completely.
No one
that's why I don't really like the term psychological thriller, because it just always feels like a bit of a cop out of we don't want to call it a horror movie.
Yeah, I don't care what anyone says. Silence of the Lambs is about a guy murdering women and skinning them. That's a horror movie. I don't care how the Oscars want to paint it. It's a horror movie. But yeah, and that I think is such a funny thing, because I'm even experiencing that with one of my really good friends. Before I knew her, she wasn't a horror fan. She said, I used to like horror. I wasn't into it. And then she just watched Midsummer for the first time. And she was like, I didn't know that horror films could be so feminist. And I was like, ooh, yeah. I've got a list for you.
Yeah, for sure.
It's been so, and getting her weekly text messages now where her and her husband are just watching Get Out for the first time, watching Us for the first time, watching these incredible movies of the last couple of years, but then also discovering old classics and messaging me about the Tales from the Hood, and how she can't believe that movie was made 20 years ago. And it's I know it's depressing that it's still very, very relevant, but I think that's the thing that we love about this genre, right? Is that you have all these different piles. If you just want something mindless and fun, you throw on a Full Moon or a trauma film. And if you want something that's gonna actually speak to you, there's a bucket for that.
And then some films can do both, which I think is really cool when films can do that, where you can kind of just go along for the ride, or you can go along for the ride and then also be kind of taking in the the other message as well. So I think it's a great format for that.
So the people who are listening, and they're sitting there and they're saying, man, I really like this Amelia girl. I want to see her movie. What are the best ways for them to see Bleed With Me right now? Is there other film festivals that are coming up that they can keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, nothing has been announced, so I can't share that information just yet about kind of future stuff. But we will be continuing some more festivals, and then we'll eventually have an online release. Again, the dates aren't, nothing has been set in stone yet, but if anyone wants to follow us on social media, it's at Bleed With Me Film on all the kind of normal platforms. So that's usually where we're going to like post updates, or on our website, which is bleedwithmefilm.com. So there we'll kind of keep people posted about where to see it. Because unfortunately, Fantasia is also geolocked to Canada. So, the audience is limited to Canada. So we definitely want to try to get it out there for more people as soon as we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Amelia.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Geekscape Network.